Okay, so listen, thank you, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable event, Team Wellbeing, a key lever to drive optimal performance. So let me start off and send a special happy Father's Day greeting to those who are in countries where today is Father's Day, which includes Spain, but it's also Italy, I think Portugal, Belgium, LATAM. And as I was realizing that today was Father's Day, I thought this kind of links to today's subject, right? So being a father, it's kind of like being a leader. There's no manual for it. And usually you only get comments when you do it wrong, not when you do it right. And it's also challenging. And I think most importantly, over the last couple of decades, it's really changed, right? And here's the kicker. I think society is evolving at a slower rate sometimes. So if you think about parenting, it's hard to show up for our kids the way we want because the environment doesn't help us. So I think this is a metaphor. It's pretty good to frame the challenge that we're discussing today. I think team well-being is something that for a while has been sounding. People have sort of realized it, but like parenting, it's in certain senses, it's new and it's challenging. I think there's a part of people don't know how to do it. And we know it's important, but again, things like culture, I know it's important, but how do I do it? And there's so many paradigms and ways of working in work that make it difficult for leaders to balance what's expected of them and these sort of new initiatives. So before we jump in, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining today and give a very special thank you to our amazing panelists, who I will introduce in just 1 minute. The format today is an informal chat where we want to leverage the experiences of these industry leaders that we've got on the panel. And then I'll do a couple of rounds with them around some fundamental questions, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. So when you do, if you want to ask a question in Q&A, I prefer you turn on your camera and just ask it in person. If you're very shy, you can drop it in the chat, and then we'll get the panelists to discuss on that. So for the moment, just make sure you've got your microphones muted, and without further ado, let's get going, and let me introduce our panelists. I guess I should start with myself. So my name is Adolfo Gómez Sánchez. I've spent over 3 decades studying and modeling what drives optimal performance in individuals and teams. That's what gets me going. What makes people tick and what makes them work well and function well. So I merged my academic background and studies on performance with my experience in the trenches as an athlete and working as a mentor to C-suite executives and to professional athletes, mostly on the ATP and WTA tours in tennis, Olympic athletes, and some Grammy nominated singers. And so what I come up with is a formula which I call the performance formula, and it's a methodology I've discovered the tools and strategies that best work. So joining me today, I've got Dr. Shuja Ali, who is an NHS trained surgeon, and then that was too easy. So then he went on to do a graduate degree in business at Yale University. And then had a long and successful career, first in McKinsey and then as MD and Chief Investment Officer in Dubai at Istamar World, which is Dubai's largest fund, if I'm not mistaken. So Shuja, besides his medical training, he brings a really deep knowledge of challenges that companies have in different phases, and especially investing in biotech and healthcare spaces. So Shuja, thank you for joining us and welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you.
Next panelist, we've got James Parks. James's journey is absolutely thrilling. He's gone from a career in professional sports as a player and coach in professional rugby in the England scene to a dynamic leap to the world of entrepreneurship, which I think is probably rougher than rugby, James, as founder of the My Day app, which is a really innovative app that I love, and that partners with leading multinationals to help drive employee health and well-being. So it's an honor to have you here, James, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bud.
And finally, we have Josh Fletcher. So Josh is the former victim of burnout himself, and he's put his money where his mouth is, and he's formed a company called Wellness Blueprint, where he specializes in stress management, burnout, and building resilience. He's got an illustrious career. He's worked with diverse groups, including special forces at NATO, race drivers, Olympic medalists, and corporate professionals across different industries. So Josh, thanks for blessing us with your participation today, and we're looking forward to getting you guys to put your heads together on this. All right, so let's jump into this. So I would say, to frame this, in both sports and business, mental health and well-being is becoming a key issue. I think we start to see professional athletes who are taking time off and recognizing the stress that before it was kind of almost taboo. People wouldn't talk about it. And corporations are starting to understand that it's not just about the sweatshop mentality and it's about, you really get a return when you start getting people performing optimally and sustaining that over time. So what I'd like to frame this first question in the context where I was talking about being a father, right? In the short term, we live in a short-term hack-driven environment, right? Where corporations and even corporate teams in the world of sports are pushed to have results today, right? It's a very short term. It's this quarter, it's this week, it's this championship, this season. So this is really challenging for a leader who's trying to implement wellness programs and social responsibility, but sometimes these take time to produce a bottom line impact. So I guess the question, I know one case, which I mentioned with you gentlemen the other day, is former Logitech CEO Bracken Darrell, who I think is a superstar. And he did commit to driving Logitech to be a plastic-free. That was on his agenda. And even though he took a hit in the bottom line, he was able to do the right thing and get it through, and in the long term create greater value. But a lot of executives, I think leaders, find challenges because they're so pressured with that short-term result long-term. So given time and cost constraints that you have found, I'd like each of you to sort of take 3 minutes and give us your view on what are your key learnings or your recommendations that leaders should focus on that it has the biggest short-term impact, the biggest drive can help. Is it culture? Is it how you structure objectives? Whatever. So I'll go around. I'll give you guys 3 minutes, and I'll put in the chat when you're getting to the end. So maybe Shuja, would you like to kick off, please?
Sure. Adolfo, thank you very much for inviting us on this panel. What I found is I don't think mental well-being is quite at the spectrum of the greenwashing that we hear about ESG, but certainly it's talked about a lot. But when I think about corporations, especially in banking or consulting, the more high-stress jobs in corporate world, that it is now discussed, but I'm not sure if it's systematically being addressed. Now, part of that is that it has to be leadership driven, like many changes in any organization, whether it's an economic driven cost cutting or growth, or the example you gave, which was reduction of plastics by Logitech. If it's not driven by the leader, it's not going to be followed through. So there is an element of the requirement that the senior most people be looking at it. And as you quite rightly pointed out, most companies are relatively short-term driven. So for them to pick a long-term goal, which they do, and they have to pivot quite often to do that, it requires the senior most leadership, whether it's the board or the CEO, to be driving it. Now, having said that, I think it does not mean that it's not happening. I have seen nuggets and very happy to see that there are small changes that you see in companies, but they do create impact. So even if it's a small change, if your leadership is not doing it, your team can do it. And if your team is not doing it, the individual senior manager within a particular team can do it. So it does not mean that just because the CEO is not driving it. So that's, in terms of examples, one of the examples I have, this was at McKinsey. Typically, if you're in the top quartile, you tend to be put on interesting projects. You are expected to perform because you performed well in the last project. And therefore, there's a risk that there's a vicious cycle where you keep performing well until at one point it just gets too much. You either don't have time in the day, or you've had several very tough projects where you were just busy. And some of the senior leaders kind of stumbled upon this. I don't think it was something that was found out through some systematic interviews or anything, but they realized that some of these top performers started to not perform after the third study or engagement. So what they did is they allowed within the system for you to take what you may consider an easier project, either shorter project or a project within an area that you're already comfortable in with a client that you were familiar with, to allow that breathing space for 1 or 2 projects so that you can then get back on the road. So I think that is an example, this is a decade or 2 ago, that shows that there are examples where people have done this successfully. In terms of speaking about mental health, I've always found, certainly in organizations I've worked in, if you've broken a leg or you have had physical surgery and had your appendix taken out or your gallstone taken out, the HR department and your employer just understands that better. But if you say that you have a mental well-being issue, it's a sign of weakness. So often it's not even addressed. And that's, I would say I've noticed a positive contribution where you are now allowed to say, I'm burning out, or I'm feeling stressed. And I think that is a definitely positive move, but it's still not the easiest thing to do within a company because of the short-term delivery that we have to do. And if you're not doing it, then your colleagues have to pick up the slack. So your colleagues aren't exactly happy when you don't show up to work and the workload has to be split between the existing employees. But I think we have a long way to go.
I think you said 2 things, TJ, that I just want to remark on. One was the McKinsey example is actually something that's been in sports for a long time. And James, you know this, it's cycling, right? You push athletes and then they have parts of their programs of their training where they reduce the intensity because the body isn't able to manage that level of stress always. So you need to have recovery time. So I think that's actually very, very, it's backed by science. And the other one that you just talked about, normalizing mental health as a real issue, I thought, wow, that really links to what I was saying about being parenting, right? I think even now, and maybe it's even more for men, but also for women, taking time off because you want to, go through a certain phase with your child is still not particularly easy to do. There's still a stigma on it. So I agree with you. I think there's a big work that leaders have to do on normalizing those things, and it's challenging. Okay, great. So James, would you like to give us your 2 cents worth on this?
Certainly, I'll make an attempt. First and foremost, thank you very much, Adolfo, for inviting me. It's always great to talk about something that I really care about, and the more we talk about it, the more we learn, because I most certainly don't have all of the answers. One of the first things I'd like to, I think, start with is our recognition that the working principles that we have in our general day-to-day have been optimized on workforces that were generally not knowledge-based workers. They were activity-based, they were out in workshops, they were building, they were manual-based tasks. And our ability to be able to mark and measure those people on productivity was easy. And since we've had a huge change, as you've said, in the way that we do work and how we create value for organizations, there seems to have been an increased prevalence and maybe just recognition of how people are able to cope within these scenarios. And the social narrative most certainly plays into this. So if we're starting already understanding that as human beings, the workplace isn't necessarily set up for optimal human optimization, it allows us to understand that if we're not right now, what can we do that's better? And we spoke yesterday as a group, and Josh, as he said, workload's not going to change. And we know that work is infinite. Until we retire, there's always going to be some work to do tomorrow. And shaping those areas, I think, is really important. And we can't get away from the fact that leaders have to be, A, responsible for the narrative that moves up and down the organization, but B, for empowering their people in an appropriate manner and fashion to enable them to bring their best selves to work. Now, these probably all sound very much like cliches and easy to say, difficult to do things, but I thought if I just touched upon a couple of areas that I think people can utilize within their organization, regardless of cost, hopefully that will give people an idea that what we're not talking about isn't just something that you have to go and spend money on. I'd also just like to caveat all of this that preventative for the large majority of us is what we're trying to achieve on the whole as an organization. There are going to be outliers that need that critical support, and making that frictionless, easy to talk about and deliver has to be of paramount importance, because they're the ones that cause the most damage. But if we step back inside, what does creating an environment that allows for psychological safety, allowing people to be like themselves, what might that look like? And I thought I'd just talk about one thing, which is the values of an organization. It's critical that leaders have time and energy that they put into dictating to the whole organization, this is what we stand for, and these are the values that we're going to live by. And the reason that I say that, because if we've got a framework upon what we believe in, we can then start hanging messaging, we can then start hanging responsibility, and most importantly, expectation on those. So once an organization's done that from the top down, it's then important that they start from the bottom up, talking to their people about, do you understand what our values, ethics, and behaviors are in our organization? Yes. Great. What do they mean to you? Do they align with your values as a person? Yes. Fantastic. And then most importantly, are you willing to act on those? And if you can be in an organization that aligns with your ethics and values, top down and bottom up, it gives us a real strong opportunity for people to turn up as their best selves. And the opportunity to enable people to deliver on those are, for me, one of the most important things. If you can allow somebody to turn up and be themselves, that's super, super important. And those lines of communication can then be tiered down through. In sports teams, it's easy, right? You've got the coach, you've got the captain and the co-captain. And if you're in a 1,000-person organization, the number of levels of communication that has to pass through and then be diversified based on their tasks is huge. So it's not easy, but I think it's a really, really good place to start. Ask your people, do they understand what the values, ethics, and behaviors that are expected of them in their organization? If yes, amazing. And then keep hiring those types of people that fit your culture. If not, if no, then there's a misalignment. And we know when we have challenges in terms of our expectations and what the reality of what we're doing is, that causes a huge amount of challenge and stress. So I hope I haven't talked around the houses too much there, but the key message is, say, make sure communication is clear and that you're hiring on those behaviors.
So you picked up a couple of things, and the next round I'll come back to you on this one, James. But let me just, so one thing was around values and aligning ideally the corporate and the individual values. One of the things I'd like to talk about later, because this comes up, is what happens when, as an employee, you feel that what's said and what's done isn't the same, right? And I think that creates a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance for people. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But another thing you said, and this will segue into you, Josh, because I know you have really intelligent and you've thought about this a lot, is James was saying, the work environment has changed, right? We've gone sort of from factory workers to knowledge workers. And there's a whole lot of changes around that. And one of the challenges is, stress comes when the demands are greater than the resources, and that can be a skill, but it can just be pure numbers, just pure volume of people, right? So it's easy to say that, but it's very hard to make decisions in corporations where you say, okay, we've got to get more people. It's actually the opposite. They're cutting back. There's so much cost challenge, right? So what do you think in that, with that challenge, if you've got somebody who's managing that challenge, a leader, right? How do I reduce stress and workload? And it's not foreseeable that I can really make it easier, or just double the number of people I have. What are the kinds of strategies that you sort of think or have seen that might be useful there?
Yeah, so it's a great lead in, and the elephant in the room is that probably things like workload and the volume of work aren't going to change. And once we kind of articulate that, and we're quite clear on that with our staff, the approach then says, well, we're in this together now. That's some of the variables we have to deal with. These are the budgetary constraints. These are the things we can do. and the focus shifts towards what can be done as opposed to what can't be done. And one military term that I picked up from my time working with the Special Forces guys is mission, team, self. Now, they always put the mission first, but they put the mission first for a very good reason, because of what they're actually doing and representing. But we can flip that on its head, and we can frame that as self-team mission. So self-team mission essentially represents looking after your own well-being to ensure that you can turn up as a key component of that team, leading the team, or as a member of that team, as your best self, to be able to deliver to the standard required sustainably. If the team, the sum of its parts, can then collaborate effectively, the mission takes care of itself. So what we then start to do is look at well-being as a collaborative approach. So let's start with self. Now, every single person on this call, you are the common denominator in every single job you will ever have. You are also the common denominator in every single relationship you have in your life. So one of the first questions is, where are you contributing to the problems that you have in terms of stress, in terms of your feeling, in terms of your health? So we're talking about self-care. How well do you look after yourself? We're talking about your engagement with numbing. So are you making poor food choices? Are you scrolling endlessly at night? Are you drinking in the evening to escape and move away and de-stress? Or are you taking proactive steps to be able to recover effectively and turn up at your best self for everybody around you, including yourself? And I mentioned drama a little bit there. So there's a distinct relationship between stress and drama is a magnet for stress. So where is drama showing up in your life, personally and professionally? What can you do to hold that drama at bay or remove it altogether? So that relates to kind of your boundaries. And then all of these things, such as self-care, such as prioritizing your sleep, removing drama, they're skills. And the very definition of a skill is that it takes time to learn, and it's trainable, and you're going to get it wrong a lot of times, but you need to be consistent with this effort. When we then move on to the next section, we talk about the team. So what can a leader do? Well, first and foremost, the leader's prioritizing themselves, and they're articulating to their staff that is high value and highly important, and that's well respected. So there's three really big questions that you can ask your team tomorrow, which I've never heard anybody do, incidentally. And you can ask the leaders within if you manage a massive group of people, you can ask your team leaders, and then those people can then disseminate these amongst their staff. So the questions are, what does well-being mean to you? That is giving your staff member permission to articulate what well-being actually means to them, because well-being is bespoke. Then the next part is, what are your boundaries? And then the final part is, how can I support you with each of these? With those three questions, they're big questions that they might need to go away and think about, but you're empowering your staff. You're saying, you know what, I care. I genuinely care about you. I care that you have an individual opinion, and I want to try to do the best that I can. Then you guys can start to work together, and you've opened the forum for people to start talking openly about their well-being and their challenges. If we do these things, then we can start the conversation as a collaborative process, as opposed to, I'm a leader, I must protect and look after my staff. We're all in this together. Everybody's well-being is important, a leader or an employee. So that's the kind of approach that I take. So it's self-team mission, as opposed to what we normally do, mission, team, self, and then understanding what your role in your own life and taking accountability for those things. And then the collaborative approach to it being those three questions. That would be some really practical early start points.
I think it's really useful, Josh. Those three questions are useful, and I want to come back to them in a minute. Let me just pick out on something you said. You said about self-care, and that's, you know, the oxygen mask on the plane metaphor, right? You know, they say if you lose pressure in the cabin and the oxygen mask comes down, put on your own mask before helping anyone else, right? And I think that's kind of what you're saying. I mean, if you don't take care of yourself, it gets really hard for you to help anyone else, right? I mean, if you can't breathe, right? It's like a company that doesn't have revenue. Everything else gets, you know, all other initiatives is really tough. So I do think there's certain things that we do have to personally take responsibility for. And I think the magic is when you then say, which is the second part I want to segue into, is how can an organization help you do that. So, okay, so you are responsible for doing it and making it known, right? But organizations aren't always that good at balancing those two. And you know, it's different if you're the CEO or you're the head coach of a sports team. And if you're a lower level person in your organization, right, you have less ability to stand up. And great organizations do create the environment where you can do that. And that's where I want to take the conversation. But one observation around, from my experience, around how I think leaders can really help to reduce the workload is what it is, and the pressure is what it is, right? And that's not going to disappear. If you're on a championship team, you need to win championships. If you're on a big company, you need to make profit. But the leader can change one thing, which is the perception about your perfection and what it means if you're not perfect, right? I think the example Sridhar was giving about, having planned down times, right? I think so many people live with the fear. It's just, it's after you haven't made a mistake in a long time, you start getting nervous, right? When I used to play competitive tennis, my coach would come up and you had to hit, 50 or 60 balls over the net without missing. And as you went up, you got more nervous because you said, shit, if I miss one, now I got to start again, right? And I think paradoxically, as you perform and do more and more good projects, you start getting nervous saying, what if I slip up? And that's where a leader can really say, no big deal, right? It's okay, we're here. And their sports has a lot to teach, right? It's about stepping out of your comfort zone. It's about stretching, and you will make mistakes if you're not, The problem is the lack of coherence that I see between corporations, what they say and what they do, right? So it's, no, we want you to innovate, take a chance. And then it's, oh yeah, but that didn't work out, so you don't get your bonus this year, right? Well then, hey, wait a minute, that's not the deal, right? Or do this and then you get chewed out. So I think leaders can really set the tone there and really make a big difference, because then people feel, I always say in my team, one thing I heard a feedback which I always appreciated was, nobody's ever afraid to call me when there's a problem in the client, because they know the first answer is, what do we need to do to fix this? As opposed to whose fault is it, right? I don't care whose fault it is. What do we need to do to fix it? And let's build it together. And then we'll figure out what we need to do better the next time, right? So I think a lot of times, if leaders just take the breath and do that, it creates a space where people can talk. And that leads me to the second question. I'm going to do another round with you guys, is the following. One of the keys to this, I think, is become clear, is each one of us has to know what's important, but we need to be able to express it when we're not getting it, right? And of course, it's really difficult because, we all interpret the world as we are, not as, and so what you say, I may interpret in a different way. And those are skills that actually nobody teaches us in school, which they actually should, because it's really challenging, right? What are my rules for feeling empowered, or what are my rules for feeling respected? And I have to be able to tell you and communicate. So here's the question. This works well in, a good sign of a healthy culture versus toxic culture is where high-performing teams can have non-threatening conversations, and they're not necessarily always positive, right? So it's radical candor. You're bringing out things. It doesn't feel like an attack, right? And there's a fine line there, right? Because as a friend of mine, who's Lorraine Steele, who's a top executive coach, says the F word, right? Feedback, right? Oh yeah, you want some feedback? Well, I'll give you some feedback. And then it becomes like a weapon, right? So it's real great performers get that, and they just want the feedback, and they just build on it, and it's not threatening. So it's, how do you create that culture? What are each of you, right? So what are your experiences on whether it's systems, processes, culture, organizational elements, whether it's applications, whatever, that support a workplace where people can contribute and innovate without fear of negative consequences? And I'll just launch one more idea and then I'll open it up. So psychological safety is a big buzzword, and I think a lot of people don't understand it, but I think it's part of the cornerstone of this, right? It's feeling comfortable contributing, it's being comfortable being you, and it's being comfortable raising your hand and not being afraid of any retribution. So with that, what ideas do you have, or what are your experiences that really create a healthy culture and allow us to then embark? Because nobody gets it right the first time, right? So we're going to say we want well-being in the workplace. We'll try stuff, but we'll probably mess it up. So how do you create an environment where that's an open discussion, and then you can get people to contribute? So Sridhar, maybe back to you.
Sure. Look, I think the examples I'm going to share with you are relatively small teams. Most of my life, I've worked in very cohesive teams, such as in surgery, you have the chief, you have the consultant doing the operating, then you have the chief, and then you have 2 or 3 people underneath. And that's very tight, very cohesive team, high stress. Same at consulting, strategic consulting. These are relatively small teams. You end up working with certain partners and certain managers, not consistently, but certainly over time. I've spent the last 20 years in investments, the same thing, that no matter how much funding you have, you end up, a small number of people can manage a large amount of money and make decisions. So all the examples I have are for more small teams rather than corporates. So I think that's kind of worth just taking it with a pinch of salt compared to the other panelists. There's a few things Josh said and James and you said, Adolfo, that just resonate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a consistency over the years, but one is you do need a space to be able to get creative ideas out, get what the real problems are. And in a closed room, you should be allowed to say what you think. And it's not about seniority versus someone junior who doesn't know something. So the contrary of that is that I have told teams that, okay, we've now sat there, we've opened the kimono, we know what's wrong. Now let's go and execute. Now, when you execute, it sounds much more like the teams that Josh is talking about. The junior guy has to do the analysis. The manager has to go and evaluate that analysis. The senior guys go in and negotiate. Everyone has their role. So we can't be constantly getting kind of this direct feedback. Do it for a period of time, address it, and then move on, and then come and revisit it. And maybe that means having regular team meetings where you're allowed to air your ideas. So that, I think, is one thing I've seen in action kind of very well. The other is to be able to see for each particular problem you're trying to solve who the right person is for that particular role. One thing, again, using examples, in 2008-9 recession, I was surrounded by very, very talented managers and VPs, directors from the right top business schools, had been managing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of private equity. But we discovered that some people, I would say the majority of people, could not handle the ambiguity of coming in day to day during that recessionary period. And I'm talking about in Dubai, this was 09 when the crisis really hit, where they weren't sure what they were going to do in the morning. So these guys were excellent players when it came to working on their project, delivering their requirement, whatever that KPI was. But as soon as the goalpost changed, they were not able to cope. And it was, I would say, my job and some of the other senior people's job to identify that, put them on projects that were less moving, more steady, and get some of the others who had not worked on those projects, who could come in the morning and work on ambiguous issues and thrive in that. So I think it is part of the manager's job to identify who's able to cope with, I would say, the softer skills that are there. And in terms of, again, I think as James said earlier, a lot of it just comes down to communication. So you have to communicate. Type A people tend to be perfectionists. So you have to teach them what is the boundaries. I'd rather get some work done and given to me in 2 hours with some errors versus not get the work done at all, not receive the work at all, or not get the document till the last moment so that I don't have time to reflect. Or come to me earlier so that I can see documents, I can see the information and guide you towards the next one. Now that's hard to do because I think the people you hire want to give you that perfect PowerPoint, the perfect Excel spreadsheet. And so you're now putting them out of their comfort zone. And they've never failed. They've done great at high school, they've done great at undergrad, they've done great at business school, they were high flyers during their career. So you have to explain to them, why do you need to not be this perfectionist that you're chasing this answer? And again, that's a discussion. So it's a mix of all what other colleagues here have said, is that if you're communicating, giving them the appropriate boundaries, time boundaries, financial KPIs, the softer KPIs, what are we trying to achieve here? Listen to them on ideas that they may have, and then we go and execute.
I think, Judy, I'd like to highlight two things you said, but I think, like all of you, it's brilliant. It's just picking out the nuggets. So the last thing you said about communication, one of the things that really resonated is the problems with communication is we don't communicate expectations, right? And I mean clearly, what does expectation mean, right? And so you'll get a lot of, I want you to perform well. Like, what the hell is that, right? I want you to have initiative. Who cares? What the hell is that? How do I measure it? And we're naturally ambiguous about that. And the more concrete you get, you give a good example, right? I'd rather see a document every 3 hours than, wait for something. That's an actual concrete expectation, which we don't do because we assume everybody understands how we think. And a lot of times it will just surprise people. They'll say, oh, really? You actually prefer that? Yeah, no, I think that's much better. And then it just takes pressure away because they're trying to do something in their own version, right? I always say the golden rule is very well intentioned, but not particularly ideal. It's treat others as you would like to be treated. Actually, that's not true. Treat others as they want to be treated, right? Because what you may want to see a document every 3 hours, but I may want a finished product, and you need to know what I'm expecting, right? So yeah. It really is in the leader's obligation to do that. And the other thing you said, which I picked up on, and I'm going to cue Josh that he's eventually, when I get to you, Josh, I know you're going to pick up on this, is the right person for each particular role, and that can change. So I know in special forces teams, that's actually the way it works, right? You can have close combat, you can have the explosives, you can have whatever, and each mission, depending on its particular traits, there's a different leader, right? Or there can be a different leader, because that's the most important skill in that particular mission. And I think in business, it's the same, right? And a great culture, says, okay, well, this may be the hierarchy, but for this role or this, this execution, you're saying we find the opportunity, who has to execute? It may be different people leading that. And you need to be able to put your ego, in the corner or on the coat rack and allow that to happen. And understand, if you look at sports, right? You were saying, James, about captain, and the coach is the one who chooses, but the captain may have a leadership role when you're on the pitch, and the captain may not be necessarily the top scorer, right? Everybody has a role, and you need to know when it's your right moment to lead, and the organization has to have that clear. So I think that's really important, and that's a sign of a really mature organization. All right, so James, why don't you pick on some of this stuff? And tell us what you think really allows an organization to have. And I know this does link with your special project, which is your app, which creates a community and environment where people can actually do that. How does that help?
Yeah, I was just laughing when Shujah, obviously the people on the call, when Shujah mentors and advises me in my organization, and the amount of emails that he's had to step in and make sure that the meaning of them is clear and objective and is aligned to the people that we're talking to has been incredible, and it's been a huge learning process for me. And that brought me back to something which is for everybody to understand. When we talk about well-being, it's not, skin off chicken, broccoli, cheap coffee and free cinema. Like, that's not what this is about. This is about understanding individuals on a biological level, being human at the core, and understanding, if you are in a leadership role, what your responsibilities are and how you can help those people be themselves, be their best selves. And we hear about this stuff, but there's so much power in it. The Daniel Pink triangle of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Are you giving your people the ability to be autonomous, to be improving themselves, learning, growing, developing inside and outside of work? And then something purposeful. Is there something in their life? And it doesn't have to be at work. It can be, in my instance, without a shadow of a doubt, my family and my work are huge drivers for me to want to be able to create that purposeful existence. Now, they can be met with discord and there's conversation to be had around the purpose, but I do think it's really important to have something for anybody to do that they are inspired by and gives them the opportunity to get up and be excited for, whether that's your sport at the weekend, your relationship at home, so there's a number of areas there. So if we take that, well-being isn't one thing, but it is something else. And what I believe and knowing then that for our people, we can help feed them and grow them and make them committed to our organization by teaching them, by helping them to grow, by improving in the areas that maybe they're not fantastic at. We've spoken about leadership and communication as two huge foundational pillars of psychological safe organizations or high performing teams. And I think it's really important to know that these aren't things that we're necessarily born with. So how can we enable our people to improve in these areas? If we've putting somebody who has a certain set of skills into a leadership position, how can we make sure that they grow into that, are mentored, are coached, are learning? So all of those things become an important part then, and it helps us add into the end product of a human being that we're trying to grow in an organization. And I think that, say, the great quote that I'll probably massacre is, what happens if we coach them and they leave? So what happens if we don't and they stay? You want these people that are growing, that are developing, that are flourishing, because that's what it's all. There's so much of life that life's so short, and I'm such a big believer in doing things that say make us fizz and pop and all of those things. Now, I don't think it has to be special. I just think it has to be done regularly. You have to be thoughtful, and it has to be, again, part of this framework that you believe in as an organization. Then another thing that sits alongside that is making sure that we cater for people's identities, whether that's preference, whether that's family, whether that's health, all of the big three buckets that I often look at: health, relationships, or work. How are we supporting our people in those areas? How are we, in smaller organizations, much easier? In large organizations, a real challenge, and something we're definitely working through. I know I've been super privileged to sit inside organizations and listen to the challenges that they're facing. And the further down the road we go of I'll call it connected disconnectedness or connected disconnectedness, whichever way you look at it, with, say, the changing world of work, hybrid and remote work, how we can make sure that we use, in my case, digital strategies which are human-led and tech-enabled to give people the support that they need on a regular basis in those nuanced niches. But I'm blown away by the conversations that you hear when you just sit and listen to the challenges that they have. And if you can find other people like them, it is, like I say, I've been in tears a number of times listening to the challenges that people have undertaken that, say, I've never even had to think about. And if we can find a way to sit, listen, bring those people together, I think that's a really powerful tool. So again, that's coming back to understanding your people, which is a leadership skill or a really good human skill. So if it's somebody sitting across from you, below you, or above you, that ability to sit, listen, learn, and be a support is massive. And I wholeheartedly believe that there's real opportunity to build organizations that people want to work for and be a part of by caring for your people in those areas. So there's that learning, skill development, caring, listening, those areas, as opposed to just necessarily giving them free stuff that they don't necessarily want to use.
So I picked up on three things you said. One is, it's like success, right? Success is not one thing. It depends, right? Or intelligence is not one thing. It depends. It has a definition for each person. So what is well-being, and what are the traits that need, and finding people with common interest and supporting that, and shaping the support mechanisms around that. So I think that's one key learning. The other one you said about how you structure your reward system, right? So whether it's or the work, right? Whether it's somebody who has autonomy and is, you put the Daniel Pink triangle. I mean, being able to shape your own work, having an opinion, working with people you like, deciding what you do it is much more. It's actually scientifically proven that it brings much greater performance than the threats and the economic carrots, right? So if you don't do it, you don't get your bonus, or you get fired, right? And that's proven. So I think that's really important. And the last thing you said that I stuck in my mind was about organizations and how you help people grow, and how do we grow leaders. And this resonates because one of the first things I will say whenever I meet a new potential client, and usually at CEO level, my question after listening to their challenges is, so what's your personal plan to be a better CEO in the next 3 years? And that goes around the room and sort of some sort of uncomfortable chuckles and looks, and what. But the question is in of itself is important, right? Have you ever even thought of that? Because that's what you communicate to the organization, right? You either say you have to be a finished product, which is stupid because the environment's changing, you're evolving, you're gonna be 30 years in a company, 20 years in a company, right? You can't be expected to be the same, and things will change. So the organization has to say, we support you in changing. And when you change, you're not gonna be good at what you're doing, right? And that's where a lot of organizations get stuck, I think. And it starts with the leader, right? It's, and the leader having the courage to say, I don't know, we're facing something I haven't thought of, right? I don't know the answers. And it's almost like taboo to say that.
And very, very quickly to add to that, Adolfo, I think a really important thing you've said there, and this isn't about changing one thing, it's never about one thing, but hopefully these messages start to give some foundational elements that people can go and look at and consider. Are we doing anything here? Like you say, what are you doing in communication, leadership, identity, say all of those, personal development, all of those things? What are you doing nothing? Are you measuring it to a certain extent? How are you validating what you're doing? So,
and that segues, Josh, this is where I want your expertise. So, we said you got to take care of yourself. So you go out and you say, this is what's important for me. And then your organization goes and does stuff. So how do you help people who then say, great, but I'm not feeling it. It's not happening, or it's not, there's inconsistency in what they're saying and what they're doing, right? What are your recommendations and your suggestions for people in those situations?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. Like, firstly, if things aren't working, you started to take positive action and they're just not working, then there is a compounding effect. And I like to think of it as tax and interest. It's like a negative choice or a less helpful choice is tax, and then you need to balance the books, of course, and then a positive choice, a positive action is interest. And you want to balance the books and have more interest than tax. So that's just one way to start thinking about it, but also compounding these positive behaviors and positive actions to make sustainable change. And that's really, really important in terms of behavior change, full stop. But when we strip it back a little bit, and I'll use a military example and then non-military example, because the principles and the thoughts go hand in glove, but they have to be translated to the context of your environment. And the idea is around setting your team up for success. So essentially, we're talking about empowering, protecting, and supporting your team, empowering them to be able to take risks and make mistakes without fear of consequence, and giving them the skills, empowering them to make the decisions for themselves, but also empowering them with the skills to be able to do so, and helping them to understand where they can and can't, like what their left and right limits are. Okay, so when you get towards this point, that's the point at which we would have a conversation. Okay, great. Well, I'm clear on that now. So that is their parameters, and their bandwidth, if you like, gives absolute clarity on what role expectation of role is. And you see that in sport all over again. And then it's protecting your individuals, so protecting your staff and yourself. And one of those areas is around boundaries. So boundaries, saying protecting somebody from themselves. I was a classic for this earlier in my career, where I would just go and go and go and go and go, and it didn't matter whether one of my employers would try to put a boundary around the amount of work I would do, saying, look, go home. But there's nothing that stopped me going and doing an extra 2-3 hours on a different project for something else. And that's why I got myself in a pickle. So then I had to take personal responsibility for that. But what they did was they protected me within their scope. So within the working hours, this is what you do, and they protected me from the top, so I didn't get all of the kind of grief from the senior management. All these different elements. So how can you protect your staff, put boundaries in place around working practices, start times, finish times, logging on, logging off, when emails can and can't be sent, all this sort of jazz. And then what's the support that you provide for them? So the military will, no, even a SF operator, even flipping Jason Bourne, people like that do exist incidentally. And they still have support with comms. They still have support with their weapons. They still have different points of contact in all of these different areas. So you need that, and you need to be able to provide that to your staff. So you need to understand what it is they need in order to be able to perform their job to the level that you expect. And that comes from effective communication. It comes from effectively modeling the behavior that you want and you expect to see, and communicating with them in a way that's both vulnerable, empathic, and shows that it's okay for them to come to you for help. And an easy question is, how can I make your life easier for you on this project? How can I support you with this? Because there are a lot of high performers, regardless of the field you're in, they'll just go. They'll get a project, they'll grab it by the teeth, and bang, they'll be gone. And then they'll get so far down the line that they'll think, oh, geez, it's almost too far down the line for me to ask for help now. Or I don't ask for help. That they'll think less of me. But if you can create that reference point, create that collaboration right from the off, then they can go off on their own. Then you can have your regular check-ins and do so with an understanding tone of empathy and kind of vulnerability, if you like. And having been in that position, most leaders have been high performers in teams at some point in their careers as well. So you create this circle where they just feel that they're trusted, they're empowered, but they also have the support. So it creates this kind of nice little compounded positive bubble, which can help to enhance performance and general well-being, I suppose.
So let me just catch on one thing you said and highlight it because I really liked it, and then I'll open it up now to all our listeners. You said something which links to what we're saying about growing people and growing leaders, and for me, it's about being a mentor, right? And it's about, I care about you, so I'm not just worried about you performing more or getting more widgets out. It's about actually making sure that you're here for the long term, right? And that's what a great coach will do. I have a flexibility coach who works with me. She's an ex-ballet dancer, and she will stop me at some point. She goes, how does it feel? Did you tweak your knee? We're going to stop. No, I can keep going. No, we're going to stop, right? And that's what you're saying. And you look back on it, and you really appreciate it, right? At the moment, you're a top performer and you get frustrated, but you look at it and you go, well, I really appreciate that they care about me that much that they say, I'd rather go a little slower, but be solid, right? And when you get that in a corporate environment or in any team environment, somebody saying, hey, okay, it's not about today, it's about the long term, and we want, we're really worried about you, and let's, put these pieces in, and you may not even see something. So as a senior mentor, I can tell you might be going down this path. I think that's really important, and that creates, well-being and a sense of belonging. So I think that's really huge. Okay, so I'd like to open it up to all of you who are listening. If you want to come on and have a question for any of the panelists or all of us, just put on your camera and just hop in and tell us what's on your mind, if any of this has at all resonated or made you think anything. Or you can drop it in the chat if you want. Okay. All right. Hi, Laura.
Hello. Thank you very much for this so interesting session. Okay. And for me, the question should be for Josh. Okay. And it should be like, what's your approach building resilience and managing stress in high pressure environments? And then how does this translate into improved performance in teams, in high performance teams? Okay.
Yeah, great question. And we could probably do a whole another session on resilience.
Yes.
But very quickly, from the stress management perspective, it's changing the relationship with stress, understanding that stress is a part of our life, that it is not necessarily a bad thing. It becomes a negative thing when our resources don't meet the demands that are being placed upon us. One thing that we can do right off the bat is start to respond to stress and not react. A reaction is often emotionally fueled, and normally in the workplace, emotions aren't really offering us a favorable outcome. So what we can do is a couple of strategies. Number one would be something I stole from the military guys and then used in motorsport and now in the corporate space, is the 3 R's: recognize, reset, and refocus. So recognize and accept, recognize there's a stressful situation taking place, accept this is difficult, this is challenging, I wouldn't choose this, but this is where I am right now. That gives you the time to calm down that emotional brain, almost like lowers down that kind of sympathetic nervous system response. The next step is it gives you the time in order to enact the next step, which is the reset. So that's something physiological to get inside your body. And that might be releasing your grip, it might be dropping your shoulders, unclenching your jaw, a longer exhale than inhale. And that again is that little tiny window that you have in order to jump onto the next level, the 3rd R, which is refocus. What is the smallest first step you can take in order to move yourself forward and in this challenging situation you're in? Now, I can attest to the fact that this works. I left my laptop on a plane and I lost 1.5 years worth of my business and 1.5 years worth of work, poof, gone. And I've been practicing the 3 R's over and over and over, which is something, again, I learned from the military guys, and it absolutely works. And it's a brilliant strategy that you can use. The second thing, and I'll just be really quick on this one, is to begin to change the relationship with it. Look at when you had a stressful situation take place. Look at what your response or your reaction was. Have a think about whether your reaction was a favorable one or not. And then finally, what could you change about that next time moving forward? And then what are the smallest steps you can take to move towards a more favorable outcome? We start to reflect on these stressful things that take place. And the good thing about this is that there will 100% be other opportunities to practice this, because stress exists absolutely everywhere in our lives every day.
Just to add one thing to what Josh said, and it's a quote. So there's a fellow, good friend of mine named Tonieko Rodriguez, and he was a motorcycle racer, ended up in a wheelchair, brilliant guy. And he says, he has a phrase that says, the first step won't get you where you want to go, but it'll get you out of where you are, right? And it just reminded me when I was listening to you, Josh, we have a tendency to want to fix it, especially when it's a big thing, right? And it's, wait a minute, what's the first immediate little step? Your third point, right? Refocus. It's one little thing, and then I start creating momentum, and momentum is such a powerful thing, right? You don't have to get the whole thing done. You just start going in the right way. So I think that's really cool. So I think we have time for one more question. Thank you, Laura. If anybody else has any thoughts or anything you'd like to bounce off one of our panelists. Okay, yeah, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Adolfo, and thanks to all the presenters. Been very engaging. A quick question. Obviously, psychological safety is a thing that's been bandied around a lot recently. I know it's cropped up with my teams. I just thought I'd invite comments from the panel on what their ideas about psychological safety are, and how you initiate that to gain that trust, gain that communication with your teams.
Sure. Who wants to go first? Well, I would just let me just make a really quick.
Adolfo, and I'll follow you.
I'll just try and do it in 30 seconds. So for me, Charlie, it's about the nature of feedback, and there's a culture where you seek feedback, and so then it doesn't become a weapon. And I think that's one of the key things about psychological safety, right? It's being able to, ask, doubt, question, return and revisit things. And sports is a great environment, right? Great athletes demand feedback because if not, they're not getting better. So if you create an environment where it's, we all ask and we share and we question and we challenge, but because we care. I think, military special forces is another environment where that's very true, right? If you see something and you don't question it, somebody may die, right? So it's good. So for me, it's about saying, challenging and questioning is good. And that's the hardest part to get. James, sorry, go ahead.
No, just very quickly, as you said, the belief you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, mistakes, etc. That's all well and good, but then how do we make sure that it's regular and not personal? And by framing that, our words are so important. We always say that there's, depending on executions, about about doing, but everything prior to that is making sure that the words we use match the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And if we can frame things so that they're not personal, that they are driven towards our mission, vision, and values, and they are part of the systematic process that we have in place. And if I use the team sport environment, say I was too many years in team sport, play on a Saturday, recover after the game, say do something social to decompress. Sunday's recovery with families. Monday morning, first thing we're doing is reviewing the previous weekend's game, win, lose, or draw. The review process about what could be done better. And we're looking at what we can do better so that all of us can succeed, grow, and develop and move towards the outcomes that we want to try and achieve. So very much Monday morning is review. Tuesday morning is then detailed review on positional stuff. There's 3 areas, sorry, team review Monday morning, individual review Monday afternoon, and then in our case it was forwards and backs. So 2 different types of positional context were then reviewed again on the Tuesday. So before you got halfway through your week, you've already done a huge amount of work. But because it's consistent, part of what we do, everybody knows it's coming. Sometimes the communication element can be delivered incorrectly, and that still causes a bit of conjecture, and that's when you've got to be really careful. And that's why you've always, again, for me, it's about making sure that the leaders in the organization pin it to the things that aren't identity focused, but are focused on the organization achieving what it needs to.
Well, thank you, James. I'm going to try and respect people's times. I know, Josh, you've dropped some things in the chat which are also useful. So after this, so first of all, thank you to everybody who's been here, and thank you for the panelists. I mean, it's just spectacular being able to leverage this much experience and knowledge and intelligence. There's obviously a lot more. We just touched the peak of the iceberg. So everybody who's participated and signed up will get an email follow up with a brief questionnaire. We'd love your feedback. We'd love to know what else what are the subjects you'd like us to have another roundtable on. And we've put everybody's contact details there. So if you do have more questions, you want to follow up personally or for your organization with any one of the speakers, myself included, you've got our contact details there. And I think we're all glad to reach out and listen and share our experience. I think we've all learned that sharing is great. We usually get more back. So thanks again to everybody. James, Shuja, Josh, thank you so much. Just to call out to Anna and the team for organizing this so well. And we look forward to having another one of these. So thank you, everybody. Have a great Easter and Father's Day, whoever's in the country where it's Father's Day. All right. Cheers. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.